Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. It's an ancient text, of course, but one that I think you'll agree still has a lot to say about human nature and power dynamics, even thousands of years later.
Absolutely. And what's so fascinating about this book is that Thucydides himself, wasn't just some historian writing from afar. He was an Athenian general who lived through this war. He experienced firsthand the brutality of it and really set out to try to understand the forces that drove it.
So before we really jump into the nitty-gritty here, can you give us kind of a quick overview of what this book is about? What are the big themes that we should be keeping in mind as we go through it?
Sure. So imagine, two superpowers clashing. That's essentially what the Peloponnesian War was. On one side, you have Athens, this rising naval power, a democracy. And then on the other side, you have Sparta, this land-based military powerhouse, a more oligarchic structure. And Thucydides explores how this conflict unfolds, but he goes beyond just, battles and dates. He really delves into the motivations of the key players, the impact of fear and honor on decision-making, and of course, just the brutal realities of war itself.
Okay, so a story about power ambition and the choices people make when the stakes are incredibly high. It sounds like there are some serious lessons to be learned here. Where does Thucydides actually start his account?
Well, right from the beginning, he makes it clear that he thinks this is going to be a big one. He believes that this war is going to be more significant than any that came before it. He even compares it to the Trojan War, arguing that while the Trojan War, we think of it from poetry, that it probably paled in comparison to the scale and impact of what the Peloponnesian War was going to be. And he was right. This conflict dragged on for decades and completely reshaped the Greek world.
So he's setting the stage right for this clash of civilizations.
Exactly. And he meticulously lays out the events that lead up to the war, showing how tensions between Athens and Sparta had been building for years. You see Athens expanding its influence, forming alliances, creating what was essentially an empire. And of course, this made Sparta nervous. They saw Athenian ambition as a direct threat to their own power.
So you got this classic power struggle brewing. What are some of the specific incidents, though, that really kind of push things over the edge into open warfare?
Well, Thucydides points to a number of smaller conflicts that became flashpoints. For example, there was a civil war in Corcyra where both Athens and Sparta got involved, each backing a different side. Then you have the revolt in Potidaea, a city allied with Athens but located very close to Spartan territory. These incidents, while seemingly localized, further inflamed tensions and drew both sides closer to war.
It sounds like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
Yeah.
And once the war begins, Thucydides doesn't shy away from showing us the brutality of it, right?
Absolutely not. He gives us these unflinching accounts of massacres, sieges, betrayals, all the horrors that come with war. One particularly chilling example is his description of the plague that devastated Athens early in the conflict. He described how this plague just ravaged the city, killing thousands and breaking down social order. It's a stark reminder of how war can unleash forces beyond anyone's control.
And, if I remember correctly, he also doesn't just describe events. He actually tries to get inside the heads of the key players to understand their motivations and how they made decisions.
Right.
That's right. He analyzes the strengths and weaknesses of leaders like Pericles, the Athenian statesman, and Archidamus, the Spartan king. And he shows us how their personalities, their strategic thinking, their ability to sway public opinion all played a role in shaping the course of the war.
And didn't he also talk about how things like fear, honor, and self-interest influenced how both sides behaved?
He did, and one of the most famous passages in the entire book is the Melian Dialogue, where Athenian envoys essentially tell the neutral islanders of Melos, surrender or be destroyed. They argue that might makes right and that morality doesn't really matter in power struggles. It's a chilling glimpse into Athenian thinking at the time.
Wow, that's pretty ruthless.
It is, and it highlights how the pursuit of power can corrupt even those who claim to be, champions of democracy and justice.
So as the war progresses, are there any turning points that you think are especially important for understanding how things ultimately unfold?
Well, one crucial turning point is the Athenian expedition to Sicily. Athens, feeling confident after some early victories, decided to launch this massive campaign to conquer the strategically important island. But the expedition ended in utter disaster. Their fleet was destroyed, thousands of soldiers died, and Athens was severely weakened as a result.
I imagine that defeat had major consequences for the rest of the war.
Oh, absolutely. It marked a shift in the balance of power. It gave Sparta and its allies new hope and set the stage for the final devastating years of the conflict.
Well, this is just the beginning of a long and complex story, so I think it's a good place for us to pause. We'll pick up in part two with the later stages of the war and explore how it all ultimately unravels for Athens.
As we kind of get into these later stages of the Peloponnesian War, you really see how that Athenian defeat in Sicily, really set the stage for their eventual downfall.
It's almost like that disastrous expedition like exposed a vulnerability within Athens, like
Yeah.
it cracked this image of invincibility that they had.
Yeah. Precisely. And their enemies were quick to capitalize on that. Sparta, in particular, started receiving increased support from Persia, both financially and militarily, and they began to challenge Athenian dominance at sea, which previously had been unthinkable.
So this shift in naval power had to have been a huge blow to Athens. I mean, their entire empire.
Oh, yeah.
Their survival depended on controlling the seas.
Absolutely. Thucydides really emphasizes the strategic importance of locations like the Hellespont, this narrow strait that controlled access to the Black Sea and vital grain supplies for Athens. Whoever controlled the Hellespont could essentially, choke off Athenian trade and cripple their war effort.
So Sparta, with its newfound resources and emboldened allies, they set their sights on the Hellespont. What happens next?
Well, this is where the Spartan general Lysander enters the picture. He was a brilliant strategist and a ruthless leader. Under his command, the Spartan navy, now bolstered by Persian ships and gold, began to directly challenge the Athenians in the Aegean.
And didn't we talk about Alcibiades earlier? The Athenian general who had betrayed his city and gone over to the Spartans. What role does he play in this phase of the war?
Ah, yes, Alcibiades. Such a fascinating and complex character. He actually ends up advising the Spartans during this period, helping them to secure funding from Persia, and even giving them tactical advice on how to best engage the Athenians at sea.
Almost hard to keep track of whose side he's on at this point. Talk about playing both sides. But ultimately, it sounds like his advice helped Sparta gain the upper hand.
It did. Lysander, using the insights that Alcibiades had provided, managed to lure the Athenian fleet into a trap at the Battle of Acre Spotami in 405 BC. It was a devastating defeat for Athens. They lost almost their entire navy. And without naval superiority, their fate was essentially sealed.
So after Aegospotami, was it just a matter of time before Athens surrendered?
Essentially, yes. The Spartans, with their allies, imposed a blockade on Athens, cutting off their food supplies. The Athenian people were starving, they were facing this bleak and hopeless situation, and in 404 BC, they were forced to surrender to Sparta, marking the end of the Peloponnesian War.
I can't even imagine how demoralizing that must have been for the Athenians. To go from the height of their power to such a crushing defeat?
Well, Thucydides describes the despair and humiliation felt by the Athenians. Their once proud empire was in ruins. Their walls were torn down. And they were forced to accept these harsh terms imposed by Sparta. It's a sobering reminder that even the most powerful and sophisticated civilizations can crumble.
This all sounds incredibly bleak. Are there any lasting insights that we can glean from this conflict that happened so long ago? Are there any glimmers of hope or lessons to be learned amidst all this destruction and despair?
Well, while the Peloponnesian War was undoubtedly a tragedy, Thucydides doesn't present it as this, simple tale of good versus evil. He doesn't offer easy answers or moral platitudes. Instead, he gives us this complex and nuanced view of human behavior, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power ambition and the often tragic consequences of choices made under pressure.
So it's less about pointing fingers and more about understanding the complexities of human nature and how those complexities play out on a grand scale.
Exactly. And by examining those complexities, we can perhaps gain a deeper understanding of the forces that drive conflict, not just in ancient Greece, but throughout history and even in our own time.
We've really journeyed through this, the rise and fall of Athens. We've witnessed the brutal realities of the Peloponnesian War and grappled with these complex choices made by leaders on both sides. But I guess the question is, what does it all mean for us? Looking back from the 21st century.
Well, and that's the real power of Thucydides' work. It's not just a historical account. It's a reflection on the human condition itself. The themes that he explores: ambition, fear, the corrupting influence of power. These things resonate across time.
One of the things that really struck me was how Thucydides shows that impact of individual personalities on the course of events. You see this with Pericles. He guided Athens through those early years of the war with, a mix of wisdom and charisma. but even he couldn't escape the pressures of public opinion and those emotional currents of wartime politics.
Right, and his famous funeral oration is a perfect example of that. It's this masterpiece of rhetoric. It's this stirring tribute to Athenian democracy. But it also hints at a certain arrogance, a belief in Athenian exceptionalism that maybe blinded them to the dangers ahead.
And then you have figures like Cleon and Alcibiades who were driven more by personal ambition and this pursuit of power than any sense of the greater good. And their actions, their manipulations, they ultimately contributed to the unraveling of Athenian society and the loss of the war.
It's a cautionary tale about the importance of leadership, not just in times of war, but in any society that's facing difficult choices. It raises questions about how we choose our leaders, what qualities we value in them, and how we hold them accountable for their decisions.
And Thucydides also doesn't shy away from showing the dark side of human nature, how war can bring out the worst in people. The cruelty, the thirst for revenge, the erosion of basic morality. I mean, the Melian Dialogue, where the Athenians essentially justify their brutality with logic of power, is just a chilling example of this.
It forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth that even those who claim to uphold noble ideals can succumb to the temptations of power and abandon their principles in the face of fear or, perceived necessity.
So after this deep dive into Thucydides, what's the one thing you hope listeners will take away from this experience?
I think the most important takeaway is the need for critical thinking, self-awareness, and a willingness to question our own assumptions and biases. The Peloponnesian War, like all wars, was a tragedy. But by studying it, by understanding the factors that led to the conflict, and the choices that were made by those involved, we can perhaps learn from the mistakes of the past and strive to build a more peaceful and just world.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thucydides' work really is a reminder that the past isn't just something to be studied. It's a source of wisdom that can help us navigate the complexities of our own time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the Peloponnesian War. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning it.